There's a small island in the Thames estuary where, at low tide, the mud pulls back and coffin lids appear. Not metaphorically, actual wooden coffins, cracking open in the salt air, with bones inside. Nobody goes there. It's off limits. And nobody has ever carried out a proper excavation to find out how many people are actually buried there. That's one site on this list. England has thousands of burial grounds. Church grounds, municipal cemeteries, Victorian garden plots. Most are quiet, well-kept, properly documented. But a small number of them have histories that are genuinely difficult to sit with. Not because of ghosts, because of facts. What happened at these sites? What was buried? Who was left without a name? And what's still down there? These are stories that England's official history tends to move past fairly quickly. This is 11 of them. Entry 1. Deadman's Island, Kent. The island doesn't look like much from a distance. It's flat, marshy, about 3/4 of a mile long, sitting in the Medway estuary in Kent. There are no buildings on it, no paths, no signs. A few wooden posts stick up from the ground, though they're not grave markers, they're erosion barriers. Doesn't really help. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the British government moored floating prisons, called hulks, in the rivers around Chatham and the Thames. These were decommissioned warships converted into holding facilities for men and boys awaiting transportation to Australia or simply serving time. Conditions on the hulks were extraordinary in the worst possible sense. Overcrowding, disease, almost no fresh air. The mortality rate was significant. When men or boys died aboard these vessels, the bodies needed to go somewhere. They went here. They were buried in wooden coffins under roughly 6 feet of tidal mud. At the time, that probably seemed sufficient. The island was remote, the tide came in and out, and the dead stayed buried. That arrangement held for about 200 years. Coastal erosion and rising sea levels have been quietly undoing it ever since. The mud has been retreating, the coffins have been surfacing, and in 2016, remains from more than 200 individuals were found on the island. Bones visible at low tide, wooden boards collapsing, some materials washed further into the estuary with every cycle. No full archaeological excavation has ever been carried out on Deadman's Island. The site is owned by Natural England and is designated a site of special scientific interest for its bird populations, not its human ones. Entry is not permitted. The bones continue to erode. There are no names attached to most of what's there. Prison hulk records exist in some form in the National Archives, but matching archival names to specific remains on an unapproachable tidal island is a different matter entirely. The number of people actually buried there is still unknown. Right now, today, the Medway keeps moving. The mud keeps pulling back. Want to know which burial ground is sitting directly underneath one of the busiest railway stations in the country? We're getting there. Entry 2. Warham Percy, North Yorkshire. There's a ruined church in a valley in the Yorkshire Wolds that takes about a mile of walking across open farmland to reach. The tower fell in 1959. The rest of the building is open to the sky. Around it are the earthwork outlines of a village that was abandoned in the early 16th century, when the last few families were evicted to make way for sheep pasture. The place is called Warham Percy, and English Heritage maintains it as an archaeological site. For about 40 years through the 20th century, archaeologists worked here every summer. What they found in the church and surrounding fields was largely what you'd expect from a medieval village: house platforms, animal bones, agricultural remains. And then, in one particular pit, something different. The bones of around 10 individuals, separated out from the main churchyard. And on those bones, clear evidence of deliberate post-mortem modification. Decapitation, dismemberment, burning, deliberate fracturing of bones after death, knife marks concentrated around the head and neck. It wasn't cannibalism, the cut patterns were wrong for that, and there were no marks around the major muscle groups that butchery would produce. Isotope analysis showed the individuals were local. These weren't outsiders. These were people from the village, and other people from the village had treated their bodies this way after death. Historic England's human skeletal biologist Simon Mays, who led the study, stated that the evidence best fits the interpretation that the bodies were mutilated to prevent feared revenants, the medieval belief that the dead could return, spread disease, and harm the living. He was careful about the word best fits. It's an interpretation, not a proven fact, but it's the interpretation that makes the most sense of what was physically found. The paper was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports in 2017. The findings are genuine. Here's what sits underneath all of it. These weren't outsiders being punished. They were community members. Someone in Warren Percy, neighbors, possibly family, stood over these bodies and deliberately cut and burned them. Whatever fear drove that decision was real enough to act on. The pit was found away from the consecrated ground, separate and for a reason. Entry 3. St. Leonard's Church Ossuary, Hythe, Kent. You can visit this one. It costs £5 for adults, £1 for children, and it's open most days between May and September. The staff are volunteers, and they're very welcoming. The room you're paying to enter is a 13th century stone chamber attached to the north side of St. Leonard's Church in Hythe. Inside it there are 4 arched bays lined with shelves, and on those shelves sit approximately 1,000 skulls, stacked in rows. Against the far wall is a single pile of long bones, femurs, tibias, the larger structural bones of the human body, measuring 7.5 meters long, nearly 2 meters wide, and just over 1.5 meters high. The church estimates the collection represents around 2,000 individuals in total. The earliest written references come from 1678 and 1679, when 2 separate visitors independently described finding an orderly pile of dead men's bones in the charnel house on the north side of the church. It had evidently been there long enough by then that nobody locally seemed to find it unusual. Who are they? This is where the history gets genuinely complicated. Over the centuries, the collection attracted various dramatic explanations. Danish pirates, soldiers from the Battle of Hastings, Black Death victims. Between 2009 and 2012, an osteological study examined all the skulls on the shelves. What they found ruled most of those stories out. The ratio of females to males was higher than you'd expect from a military group. Nearly 10% were subadults, young people, teenagers, children. These were not soldiers from one battle. Black Death victims were typically disposed of with quicklime, not carefully stored. The current conclusion from the church's own researchers is that these were Hythe residents buried in the churchyard over an extended period. When the church was extended eastward in the 13th century, it was built over earlier graves. Those disturbed bones were moved into the crypt. The collection probably also incorporates remains from 4 other local Hythe graveyards that had closed by 1500. No accurate dates of death have been established. No names exist. The skulls have been on those shelves for at least 350 years of recorded history, and probably considerably longer. They face outward. That's just how they were arranged. Entry 4. Rothwell Bone Crypt, Northamptonshire. In the early 18th century, a gravedigger working in the grounds of Holy Trinity Church in Rothwell, Northamptonshire, broke through the surface of the ground and fell into a room that nobody in the village had known was there. The earliest documented mention of a crypt below the church appears in 1712, written by John Morton, rector of a nearby parish. Whatever happened, and the gravedigger story, while traditional, can't be pinned to an exact date. By the early 1700s, it was clear that something substantial was buried under the floor. The room is a medieval charnel chapel, built around the late 13th century. It contains the skeletal remains of hundreds and possibly thousands of people. Long bones stacked along the walls, skulls arranged on shelves. The kind of organization that makes it clear someone, at some point, put real effort into maintaining this place. The University of Sheffield began formal scientific study of the bones in 2016 and carried out radiocarbon dating on 5 skulls. 3 of them dated to between the late 13th and early 15th centuries, consistent with the architecture of the room itself. One of those medieval skulls had evidence of perimortem trauma, fractures radiating from a blow to the head. One person, somewhere in this collection, died violently. The legend that these were soldiers killed in a specific battle has been the dominant explanation for a long time. The radiocarbon results suggest it isn't that simple. Men, women, and children are all represented. The bones span multiple centuries. Like height, the most likely explanation is accumulated charnel practice. Bones moved from the churchyard when new burials needed the space, stored below the church indefinitely. The crypt is open to visitors on specific days each year. Rothwell itself is an ordinary market town in Northamptonshire, 30 minutes from Northampton on the A6. The bones have been there, under the church floor, for somewhere between 600 and 700 years. Here's one for scale. The next entry involves 3,300 skeletons, discovered under a major London transport hub. Entry 5. Bedlam Burial Ground, Liverpool Street, London. Every weekday morning, tens of thousands of commuters pour through Liverpool Street Station. The Crossrail entrance on Bishopsgate is one of the busiest pedestrian junctions in the city. Below the ticket barriers, escalators, and platform concourses, the archaeology starts at about 4 meters down. Between 2015 and 2016, archaeologists from the Museum of London Archaeology excavated the former New Churchyard, also known as the Bedlam Burial Ground, after Bethlem Royal Hospital, which stood nearby. The ground had been in use from 1569 until 1739. Moeller excavated approximately 3,300 human skeletons from the site, described as the largest assemblage of 16th and 17th century skeletal remains ever recovered in London. The burial ground served a broad cross-section of London's population: the poor, religious dissenters, plague victims, and ordinary Londoners, for whom every other cemetery was full. The connection to Bedlam is real but partial. The asylum's patients were among those buried here, alongside many others. Within the wider excavation, archaeologists found a separate mass burial pit containing around 45 individuals. The bodies had been placed in coffins, but with no soil between the layers, stacked directly on top of each other. The configuration is consistent with a catastrophic mortality event, where normal burial pace couldn't be maintained. Analysis later identified Yersinia pestis DNA in several individuals from the pit, strongly linking it to the Great Plague of 1665. Moeller's initial publication was careful to frame this as probable rather than certain, which is the correct position. Subsequent research identified the names and backgrounds of over 5,000 individuals from burial records connected to the site. 5,000 named people. Directly under where the Crossrail platforms now stand, one skeleton was found with an iron padlock around the neck, an anti-grave robbing measure used by people who could afford it. His name was eventually identified from parish records. Most of the other 3,300 had no such protection. Most remain anonymous. Entry 6. Thornton Abbey Mass Grave, Lincolnshire. Thornton Abbey is a ruined Augustinian priory in rural Lincolnshire, founded in 1139. What remains of it, a substantial gatehouse, some wall sections, the outline of the precinct, sits in open countryside outside the village of Thornton Curtis. English Heritage manages the site. In 2013, University of Sheffield archaeologists were excavating a natural mound near the south wall of the inner precinct when they found a mass grave. They excavated at least 48 individuals. 27 of them were children, aged between 1 and 17. Among the 17 adults where sex could be determined, 6 were women. The grave contained secular individuals, not monks, within the monastery's own grounds. The bodies had been placed with care, not dumped. They were arranged in 8 overlapping rows, mostly shrouded, with the lower legs of one row fitted into the space between the heads of the next. It was organized. There was just no time, or no space, for anything else. Ancient DNA analysis identified Yersinia pestis, the Black Death pathogen, in the skeletal remains. Radiocarbon dating, combined with pottery and 2 silver pennies of Edward III, found in the grave fill, placed the burial in the mid-14th century. The Black Death reached this part of Lincolnshire in the spring and summer of 1349. What makes Thornton significant is what it overturned. The previous assumption among historians was that rural populations, facing lower raw numbers of deaths than cities, could manage plague casualties using normal burial practices. Thornton shows that this was not always true. A small rural community was overwhelmed badly enough that it buried its civilians, including 27 children, in a mass grave within the monastery walls, as close to the hospital chapel as it could get. The grave was published in the journal Antiquity in 2020. It remains the first confirmed Black Death mass grave found in a non-urban English setting. The abbey ruins are open to visitors. The gravesite is not marked. Entry 7. East Smithfield, London. In the autumn of 1348, the Black Death arrived in England through the southern ports. By early 1349, it was moving through London. The city's existing churchyards filled within weeks. There was nowhere left to put the dead. The Bishop of London donated land just outside the city walls at East Smithfield, near the Tower of London. 2 emergency burial grounds were established on the site, one in 1348, a second a year later, as the first filled up. They operated for approximately 2 years. Archaeologists excavated the East Smithfield Cemetery in 1986 and 1988 as part of work on the Royal Mint site. What they found is now the largest and most comprehensively studied Black Death cemetery in England. The estimate is that approximately 2,400 Londoners were buried there. At the height of the plague's passage through the city, historical records suggest around 200 people were being buried per day. The cemetery contains both individual graves and mass burial trenches. The mass trenches show evidence of rapid, continuous use. Bodies placed in rows, efficiently and without obvious ceremony, because the pace of death didn't allow for anything else. The site is now the Radisson Blu Edwardian Hotel and adjacent development. There's a plaque. The bones that were excavated are held and studied by the London Museum, and the population has been extensively used in bioarchaeological research, contributing to what we now know about age, diet, disease, and origin in 14th century London. 2,400 people. A 2-year window. The ground is now a hotel car park. The next site is half a mile away, and it's still mostly unexcavated. Entry 8. Charterhouse Square, London. In March 2013, Crossrail workers excavating near Charterhouse Square in Farringdon broke into a section of medieval ground. 25 skeletons were recovered. Ancient DNA testing confirmed Yersinia pestis. Pottery and other material placed the burials in the mid-14th century. This site, the West Smithfield Burial Ground, was created during the Black Death by the Bishop of London in 1348, around the same time as East Smithfield. The Charterhouse Monastery was founded on the same land in 1371, built directly over the burial ground. When the monastery was dissolved in 1537, and the buildings later converted into the Charterhouse institution that still occupies the site today, the ground beneath remained largely undisturbed. The excavation report for the site estimates that over 5,000 plague victims may be buried in the West Smithfield ground in total. Some historical estimates run considerably higher, though the 5,000 figure is what the formal archaeological reporting supports. 25 have been excavated. The rest are still there. Above them, the Charterhouse is still a functioning institution, an almshouse for elderly residents, a school, a museum open to the public. Charterhouse Square is a green space used for lunch breaks, dog walking, and occasional film shoots. The Black Death dead from 1348 remain beneath the square. The monastery built on top of them is still standing. The Crossrail tunnel runs nearby. Nothing about the surface suggests any of this. Entry 9. Crossbones Graveyard, Southwark. On Red Cross Way in Southwark, there is a set of iron gates covered with ribbons, photographs, plastic flowers, laminated notes, and small objects left by visitors. Behind the gates is a small garden, maintained as a memorial. This is Crossbones. The historian John Stowe mentioned a single woman's churchyard in Southwark in 1598, describing women who were forbidden the rites of the church while living and excluded from Christian burial after death. These were the Winchester geese, women licensed to work in the brothels of the Liberty of the Clink, an area outside the City of London's jurisdiction, regulated by the Bishop of Winchester. The church wouldn't bury them. The ground at Crossbones, which was unconsecrated, would. The link between Stowe's medieval single woman's churchyard and the current Crossbones site on Red Cross Way is traditional rather than archaeologically proven. The site's own history acknowledges this. What is confirmed is that the ground was in use as an unconsecrated pauper burial ground by at least the 17th century, and remained so until 1853, when it was officially closed because it was completely overcharged with dead, and further burials were considered inconsistent with public health. Museum of London archaeologists excavated 148 skeletons from the site in the 1990s. Over 70% of the examined individuals had not reached their 16th birthday. The site is estimated to hold the remains of around 15,000 people in total, more than half of them children. In 2022, excavations near the site's boundary uncovered a Roman mausoleum with a preserved mosaic floor. People have been burying their dead at this location, or near it, for close to 2,000 years. The ground is owned by Transport for London. The memorial ceremonies continue on the 23rd of each month. Entry 10, Spitalfields Charnel House, East London. Spitalfields Market operates every Thursday through Sunday. It's been a trading site since the 17th century, and the current covered market structure is a Victorian-era building that was substantially redeveloped in the 1990s. It's busy, commercial, well-lit. The kind of place you go to buy artisan cheese and vintage clothing. Underneath parts of the surrounding area, beneath streets that now carry delivery vehicles and market pedestrians, is what remains of the Hospital of St. Mary Spital, an Augustinian priory founded in the late 12th century, one of medieval London's main institutions for the sick and dying. During excavations from the 1980s through to the early 2000s, Museum of London archaeologists uncovered over 10,000 human skeletons from the St. Mary Spital site. This was the cemetery associated with the hospital, used across several centuries, and the scale of the find made it one of the most significant medieval burial assemblages ever recovered in England. What they also found was a separate stone crypt, a charnel house built around 1320. The purpose of charnel houses in medieval practice was specific. When a churchyard ran out of space, older graves were reopened, the bones removed, and the ground used again. The disarticulated bones, clean skulls, long bones, were stored in the charnel crypt. The space above ground was freed up. This cycle repeated as long as the hospital operated. The charnel crypt is now accessible as an archaeological viewing site. You can stand in the same stone room where medieval London's dead were stacked and stored. The building survived the Reformation by being converted into a private house. It survived subsequent centuries being used as storage. It survived a threatened 1990s demolition through a public campaign. The bones were excavated and are held by the Museum of London, 10,000 individuals, from a site that is now, largely, a market. Entry 11. Riley Graves, Iam, Derbyshire. In a hillside field just east of the village of Iam in the Peak District, there's a small oval enclosure made of dry stone wall. Inside it are 7 graves, 6 headstones, and 1 larger table tomb. They belong to the Hancock family, John Hancock and his 6 children, who died within 8 days of each other in August 1666. Iam had been in self-imposed quarantine for over a year by then. In 1665, plague arrived in the village in a parcel of cloth from London. The rector, William Mompesson, persuaded the community to seal itself off from the surrounding area to prevent the disease spreading into Derbyshire. They stayed. The plague moved through the village for 14 months. Of the population, estimates vary, but around 200 to 300 were lost. 260 people died. Normal burial in the parish churchyard had, for practical and sanitary reasons, been largely abandoned. People buried their dead where they could, in gardens, in farmyards, in fields. John Hancock's wife, Elizabeth, buried her husband and 6 children in Riley's field over the course of 8 days. She survived. She then walked back down into the village. The Riley graves are now a scheduled monument, maintained and documented by Historic England. The enclosure is accessible on foot from the village. The headstones are 18th century, replacing earlier markers, and the inscriptions are still legible. The quarantine decision saved the surrounding towns and villages. The cost in Iam was heavy. Families buried in fields, without clergy, without churchyards, because keeping the disease contained was considered more important than standard burial practice. Nobody ever went back to move them into the churchyard. They're still in the field. Every location on this list is real, documented, and in most cases still physically there, accessible to visitors, studied by archaeologists, sitting beneath ordinary streets or in ordinary countryside. What connects them isn't the supernatural. It's the weight of numbers and the way that history tends to prioritize the living over keeping accurate records of the dead. The bones at Hythe have been on those shelves for at least 3.5 centuries, and nobody knows who they were. The plague victims at Charterhouse Square have been under that garden since 1348. The convicts on Deadman's Island are still eroding into the Medway with every tide. If any of these histories are familiar to you, or if you know of a burial ground that should have been on this list, leave it in the comments. There's no shortage of candidates.